Every night for 30 years, the same ritual played out with clockwork precision. The iconic blue curtain parted. Johnny Carson strode his mark, delivered his monologue, and settled into his chair behind the desk. For millions of Americans, it was television's most dependable nightly comfort, smooth, polished, and seemingly effortless. But behind that well-oiled machine lurked a chaotic reality that viewers rarely glimpsed. Johnny had a sixth sense about it the moment they walked out, revealed a former Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson throughout the 1970s. He could tell within seconds if someone was drunk, stoned, coked up, or worse. His eyes would get this certain look, part amusement, part, oh God, here we go. While Carson maintained his legendary cool on camera, the backstage reality was often far more dramatic. Production assistants were trained to watch for warning signs. Segment producers kept emergency backup plans on standby. Executives occasionally hovered nervously in the wings. The show had even developed an elaborate system of subtle on-air signals. If Carson touched his tie while introducing a guest, it told the crew the person was not entirely sober. If he straightened his cards twice, it signaled the director to keep camera shots simple, because the guest might be unpredictable. The 70s were wild, admitted the former producer. You have legitimate legends, Oscar winners, musical icons, literary giants, showing up so impaired they could barely remember their own names. Johnny somehow had to make it all look normal, while essentially babysitting someone having an entirely different experience of reality. To understand why so many celebrities arrived in altered states, you have to understand the unique pressure of the Tonight Show green room. People don't realize the pressure, explained a former talent coordinator. Carson wasn't just any interviewer. A good appearance could launch careers overnight. A bad one could haunt you for years. And unlike today's pre-planned, heavily prepped talk show segments, Johnny wanted genuine, unplanned conversation. That terrified a lot of people. This pressure created the perfect environment for chemical assistants, whether alcohol from the always-stocked green room bar, pills from private stashes, or substances brought by entourages who knew their famous employers needed something to take the edge off. The green room bar was reportedly top-shelf everything, with Carson's personal approval. The unofficial policy allowed one drink, maybe two at a push, but enforcing that limit with major stars was another matter entirely. Beyond alcohol, the era's permissive attitude toward recreational substances meant celebrities often arrived having indulged in their preferred method of relaxation, from marijuana to cocaine prescription medications, sometimes in combinations that became very apparent once the cameras rolled. This was when Studio 54 was at its peak, noted a television historian specializing in late-night TV. Rock stars were living like Roman emperors. Even Wall Street was awash in cocaine. The Tonight Show didn't exist in a vacuum. It reflected the culture of its time. George Carlin transformed from clean-cut comedian to counterculture hero during the early 1970s, growing his hair, changing his material, and fully embracing the era's drug culture. These changes were reflected in his Tonight Show appearances. He riffed like a genius and grinned like a stoner. Remember camera operator, who worked many of Carlin's segments. There was never any question. George wasn't hiding it. That slightly glazed look in his eyes was practically part of his brand by then. Carlin appeared on The Tonight Show over 130 times, establishing himself as one of Carson's most reliable and popular guests. Yet despite this apparent approval, Carson never selected him as a guest host, a distinction many other comedians received. The unspoken reason was reliability. Carson respected Carlin's brilliance, but wasn't confident he could handle running the show solo for 90 minutes. What made Carlin unique among high-flying guests was his functionality. Unlike others who became incoherent or unpredictable, Carlin remained sharp, witty, and professional, just with a distinctly relaxed vibe that regular viewers definitely noticed. Carlin was what we called a functioning herbalist, quipped the Tonight Show staffer. The weed didn't impair him. It was part of his creative process. Carson adapted his interview style accordingly, asking open-ended questions that allowed Carlin's mind to wander in the fascinating, often hilarious directions that made him a counterculture hero. Carlin himself later confirmed suspicions in his autobiography, writing that, of course, he was usually stoned during his Carson spots in the 70s. It was the 70s, and he was George Carlin. If Carlin represented functional cannabis use, Richard Pryor embodied something far more volatile, a genius comedian whose substance issues sometimes pushed the night show appearances from brilliant to genuinely concerning in the blink of an eye. He was hilarious until he got cosmic, recalled a stage manager who worked several of Pryor's appearances. Richard could start a segment as the sharpest, funniest person on the planet. Then suddenly his eyes would change, and he'd go somewhere else mentally. Johnny would have to work like a traffic cop to get things back on track. One particularly memorable segment from 1978 started conventionally enough, with Pryor discussing his latest projects. Midway through, however, he began a joke about his childhood that gradually dissolved into a disconnected series of observations, his focus visibly drifting. The audience, unsure whether this was an intentional comedic choice or something unplanned, laughed nervously. You could see Johnny shift into protection mode. The stage manager continued. He jumped in with a quick question to redirect Richard, made a joke to cover the awkward moment, then smoothly transitioned to a commercial. It was masterful crisis management, disguised as casual conversation. Carson never judged Pryor for his substance use. He simply worried about him. He'd check on him through mutual friends after particularly erratic appearances. As one writer who knew both men recalled, Pryor later expressed genuine gratitude, saying Carson could have made him look like a fool, but instead drove the car when Pryor was too spaced out to handle the interview himself. Not all chemically enhanced Tonight Show appearances involved comedians. Some of the most alarming incidents came from unexpected sources, like the distinguished literary icon whose 1980 appearance became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Completely baked was how one production assistant succinctly described Truman Capote's infamous Tonight Show disaster. Capote had appeared many times over the years, usually displaying the sharp wit that made him a talk show favorite. His January 1980 appearance was shockingly different from the moment he wobbled onto the set. He was slurring so badly you could barely understand him, recalled a sound technician who worked that night. His head kept nodding forward. Then he'd snap back to attention with a startled look. The control room was panicking. Unlike his handling of Carlin or Pryor, where Carson adapted to their altered states with good humor, his response to Capote's condition was markedly different. Carson's smile tightened visibly. His questions simplified dramatically. The moment they cut to commercial, he reportedly stormed backstage and told the talent coordinator, "Never again. He's done." What particularly angered Carson wasn't just the impairment itself, but what it represented. A fundamental lack of respect for the show and its audience. Capote's apparent combination of pills and alcohol had rendered him essentially non-functional as a guest, and that was a line Carson would not forgive. Capote never appeared on The Tonight Show again during Carson's tenure, becoming one of the very few guests to receive a lifetime ban. Some guests made no pretense whatsoever about their relationship with recreational substances, none more famously than comedy duo Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong, whose entire brand was built around cannabis culture. They weren't acting, laughed a former segment producer who worked on several of their appearances. That's just where their brains lived. What made Cheech and Chong unique was Carson's willingness to essentially incorporate their state into the comedy itself. Rather than working around or disguising their obvious cannabis consumption, Carson played the straight man to their stoner antics, putting on an exaggerated square persona, pretending not to understand their drug references, and asking innocent questions that set them up perfectly. During one memorable appearance promoting their film Up in Smoke, Chong began a rambling, disconnected anecdote about the movie's production. Rather than redirect or rescue him, Carson simply let the story unspool, occasionally glancing at the camera with a raised eyebrow that had the audience howling. Johnny knew exactly what he was doing, explained the segment producer. He was telling the audience, yes, they're exactly who you think they are. It wasn't about exposing or embarrassing them. It was about authenticating their brand. The counterculture revolution brought new substances and new attitudes into mainstream, sometimes colliding spectacularly with the conventions of network television, as happened during Peter Fonda's now legendary 1970 appearance. He talked about time travel. The segment lasted 5 minutes, recalled a director who worked on the show that night, neatly summarizing one of the most bizarre interviews in Tonight Show history. Fonda, already famous for Easy Rider and his open advocacy of psychedelics, arrived seemingly under the influence of what staffers strongly suspected was LSD. His pupils were described as enormous. He kept staring at the studio lights, then at his hands, then would suddenly snap back and attempt to answer a question Carson had asked 30 seconds earlier. The breaking point came when Carson asked about upcoming projects, a standard promotional question. Fonda began an answer about a new film, then abruptly shifted to discussing how time is not linear, but wraps around us like a blanket, and how everyone is riding the cosmic wave of consciousness. Carson tapped his cards twice on the desk, the emergency code for an immediate commercial break. No matter where they were in the segment, they were only 5 minutes into a scheduled 12-minute interview. When the show returned from the break, Fonda had been quietly replaced by the next guest, with no explanation offered. Carson simply continued as though nothing unusual had occurred. His verdict afterward was characteristically pragmatic. Let's give him another chance in a year or so. Everyone has off nights. Not all chemically enhanced appearances were played for laughs. British actor Oliver Reed's 1975 visit demonstrated how quickly substance use could transform entertainment into something genuinely alarming. Reed, already notorious in Britain for his hard-drinking persona, arrived for his Tonight Show appearance visibly intoxicated. What started as slurred but manageable responses quickly escalated as Reed became increasingly animated and unpredictable. At one point, he stood up unexpectedly and began demonstrating a fighting stance, causing visible concern among crew members. Security moved closer to the stage. Carson had zero tolerance for aggressive or threatening behavior, regardless of the cause, explained his former producer. He could handle someone being stoned or a little drunk, but the minute it turned hostile, he shut it down. Carson took firm control, interrupting Reed's rambling, redirecting forcefully, and cutting the segment significantly short. His message to the booking staff afterward was unambiguous. I don't care how big a star someone is. If they can't control themselves, they don't sit at my desk. Oliver Reed joined a very short list of performers permanently banned from The Tonight Show. Some appearances became legendary not for obvious impairment, but for the persistent whispered rumors that followed. None generated more speculation than Sammy Davis Jr.'s hyperkinetic 1974 interview. Cool on stage, chaos backstage, summarized production assistant who worked that night. Davis was a Tonight Show regular and one of Carson's favorite guests, a consummate entertainer whose musical talent, comedy, and fascinating life stories made him television gold. But his 1974 appearance stood out for its unusually amped-up energy. He was talking a mile a minute, couldn't sit still, kept interrupting himself to start new thoughts, recalled a sound technician. His eyes were darting everywhere. He just seemed accelerated. Industry insiders recognized the telltale signs of cocaine use that had become increasingly common in entertainment circles during the mid-1970s. What set Davis apart from some of the other guests on this list was that his professionalism never wavered. Despite his apparent chemical enhancement, he remained charming, entertaining, and fully in control of his performance, just with the volume turned up considerably. He delivered exactly what the audience wanted. Davis himself neither confirmed nor denied the rumors in later years. When a reporter once asked directly about that appearance, he reportedly responded with a smile. Baby, the 70s were the 70s. Let's leave it at that. What Carson's handling of these 7 guests ultimately reveals is a man navigating a cultural revolution in real time, finding a middle ground between reflecting the era's shifting attitudes and maintaining standards appropriate for broadcast television. His philosophy was pragmatic rather than moral. He developed what his staff called an impairment spectrum, different responses depending on how a guest state affected their ability to create good television. George Carlin, stoned but brilliant? No problem. Truman Capote, incoherent and barely conscious? Big problem. It was never about the substances themselves. It was about respecting the audience and the medium. Johnny had 3 rules that couldn't be broken, no matter who you were, explained a longtime staff member. Don't threaten anyone, don't disrespect the audience, and don't waste airtime. Break those rules, and you wouldn't be invited back. Period. By treating chemically enhanced appearances as situations to be managed rather than scandals to be sensationalized, Carson maintained The Tonight Show's reputation as a place where stars felt safe even when they occasionally arrived less than sober. That, more than anything, is why he remained on top for 30 years.